After a careful and critical appraisal of many experiences and arguments, I've come to accept the existence of deeper spiritual layers that cannot be adequately defined by the conventional concept of time. The great physicist Wolfgang Pauli wrote a stunning paper in 1957 called Phenomenon and Physical Reality, a tour de force of syncretizing quantum physics with phenomenological reality. He concluded that reality cannot be boiled down to the purely material, atoms bumping around like they own the bloody place. Instead, reality is relational, participatory, and open-ended, defined by the interplay between observer and nature. In other words, you, mate, you matter. You're both matter, yes, and also the original meaning of that word from Aristotle, potential. Matter and potential. Reality isn't and cannot be just out there. It's defined by engagement with both the world and the unseen. Now, he sent this paper to his longtime friend and collaborator, Carl Gustav Jung, and then he died, famously in room 137, the reciprocal of the fine structure constant, 1/137, a figure discovered by his mentor Arnold Sommerfeld in 1915, and a number which haunted him his entire life. He remarked upon realizing this, lying on his deathbed, "I'm never getting out of here alive." Today, you and I are going to do something, dare I say, never attempted on YouTube before. A full-scale reconstruction of Jung and Pauli's entire theory of reality. Summary videos and vibey nonsense shall both be denied a proper burial. We are going to cover all of it. The archetypes, quantum mechanics, synchronicity, ACAUSALITY, the archetype of number, and tons more. I've been looking forward to this for bloody yonks, mate. And speaking of yonks, I've been absent from YouTube for a good few months now, but I wasn't staring at the wall. At the time this video drops, there are now 43 full episodes of the Jung Project ready to go. Over 70 hours of line-by-line, no-nonsense exegesis on Jung's collected works 8. If this kind of depth is your thing, if you actually enjoy this level of epistemic siege, you can join us. 20 quid gets you immediate access to the lot, plus a new episode every Friday and a Discord built like an old-school intellectual tavern. Proper study, proper individuation, and yes, proper memes. The link is down below. Now, let us reconstruct Jung and Pauli. The main source I've used for this is Atom and Archetype. Those are the Jung-Pauli letters. But I've drawn on all of Pauli's writings on physics and philosophy and all of Jung's collected works. So what follows is Jung and Pauli completely built from the ground up, uncut, raw, and presented in a way which cuts through the letters and lays out exactly what those two great men built. Let's begin with sketching both of them, as both were far more colourful and odd than history genuinely likes to emphasise. So enter the dramatis personae. First up, born in 1875, Carl Gustav Jung was part of the very first generation of psychoanalysts. Starting his career in experimental psychology under Eugen Bleuler at the Bergholzli Research Hospital in Zurich, he contributed seminal research to the nascent theory of complexes, identifying them as feeling-toned clusters of ideas surrounding an emotional affective core. The complex remained the central focus of his work all the way from 1904 until his passing in 1961. For spoiler alert, what did Jung later say lie at the heart of a complex, and thus all neurosis and mental distress? Why, an archetype. Of course, everyone's favourite word, apparently, and we're going to get there shortly. When Freud burst onto the scene as the lad of Europe, Jung famously wrote love letters to him. They courted one another at the Maldives, and the pair, well, they got married. They adored each other. Freud is the pioneering Moses, illuminating the nature of neurosis and hysteria, and Jung as his crown prince. By 1907, Sigmund was busy fully consolidating his libido theory, being an extremely productive monster of a man, working, I'm not joking, 12 hours a day on just clinical work and crystallizing his theories outside of this. And Jung was hard at work applying psychoanalysis to the residents at the Berg Holsley. Contrary to popular belief, of which history has been dealt an enormous misservice, Jung and Freud did not end up getting divorced over such topics as, oh, Jung's obsessed with religion and weird things, or Sigmund, why are you so obsessed with sex? Stop it, Sigmund. No. Jung simply said, very calmly, first in private letters, then in his published output, that Freud's theory wasn't complete. How could sexual or eros-based libido account for example, loss of reality orientation in people with schizophrenia? Jung said, it can't. And Freud said, it might. Stop rushing ahead. Tit for tat. That went on for years. C'est la vie. After much arguing on such things, Jung saying, stop being reductive, and Freud saying, please, would you stop misunderstanding me? Please, the pair broke up. And this was a big deal, despite it being rather understated at the time, in that typical Edwardian fashion. There was no internet cancellation back then, only slightly sarcastic public communications in writing. Now, this fracture between Freud and Jung lives on today. The Freudians and the Jungians are distinct schools who have virtually nothing to do with each other. Anyway, Jung promptly descended into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a rather formal phrase for, help me, I've started to lose my damn mind. Visions and dreams, intrusive fantasies, so overwhelming that he deliberately slept with a gun in his bedside drawer in case it all got too much. Upon coming out the other side, the process of which was documented in the ever-mythologized Red Book and the Black Books, Jung had consciously integrated the material thrust upon him. He took his first conscious step towards individuation. Now, such a thing always comes with a sense of destiny, a sense of calling. And what did Jung see his calling to be? To found a genuinely scientific study of the unconscious, a scientific psychology which would take equal account of the findings of material science and investigation into the dynamic unconscious, an endeavor which he called analytical psychology. Not how that term is used today, by the way. Today it typically means practicing Jungian. But Jung meant it as, let's actually do genuine science on the unconscious, please, without reducing everything to eros, Sigmund, I'm looking at you, or to the will to power, Adler, I'm looking at you. And also, let's not pathologize everything that's outside the norm, lads. The materialist model of automatically labeling everything which deviates from the norm as pathology isn't exactly helpful when we look at religion, artists, and brilliant minds of all kinds, is it? Now, that's all you really need to know about Jung for our purposes today. To be honest, that was his mission, and he was obsessed by it. That's literally what the outcome of the Red Book was. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't Jung encountering demons and waltzing around like a prophet, but the acceptance of what he felt very deeply as his vocation. He drew on the pioneers which came before him, and this is really, really important. Freud, Adler, Janet, Bleuler, all the lads, and applied rigorous inductive reasoning to create an epistemology and basic model of the psyche, which, in my view, is absolutely watertight. He drew on other sources, myth, religion, alchemy, to get other angles on what the nature of the unconscious really was. And that's what he stuck to, exclusively, until he died. Was it extreme? Yeah. But was it also incredibly simple? Yes. No need for mythologizing a man who told everyone repeatedly that he wasn't the Messiah, but rather something much closer to a very naughty boy. Now, whilst Freud and Jung were arguing about libido and psychosis and whose turn it was to do the grocery shopping, the famous physicist Wolfgang Pauli over in Vienna was barely a 12-year-old lad. I've covered much of his life story in my previous Jung Pauli video, so I'll only give you the lightning bolt today. If you've seen the previous video, I do hope you enjoy the recap. If you haven't, mate, you're in for a treat. A teenage obsessive with mathematics, Pauli cut his teeth at university under the mentorship of the brilliant Arnold Sommerfeld. His first major contribution was a monograph on Einstein's theory of relativity, published when he was just 21 years old. Einstein himself thought it was absolutely masterful. Imagine Einstein telling you, when you're 21, that you've understood his theories better than basically anyone alive. It's proper prodigy behaviour. Knowing full well he had something rare on his hands, Sommerfeld set Pauli to uncover the mathematics behind one of the biggest unsolved problems of the day, the anomalous Zeeman effect. To avoid any detours today, this was essentially the observation that when you place an atom in a weak magnetic field, the spectral lines that it gives off go a bit weirder than usual. No one understood this mathematically, so Sommerfeld said, "Pauli, mate, it's up to you." And Pauli tried repeatedly to no result. He sank into despair and began drinking medieval quantities of wine whilst womanizing in bars late at night. One could say, spoiler alert, that his intellectual life and his anima, that psychodynamic representing a man's connection to life, eros, and meaning, were reflecting each other. If you know anything about Jungian psychology, you'll spot it from a mile off. But of course, such a thing doesn't matter in science, right? Who cares if your emotional life behaves like a Jackson Pollock painting? The intellect is its own discrete instrument, right? Well, fast forward a bit, and Pauli is suddenly having an intuition, a very weird one. Up until then, there had been 3 quantum numbers describing the properties of electrons. Let's slow this down for a moment. The first, proposed by Niels Bohr, described the number of electron shells. Maximum of 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 in the second, and so on. The principal quantum number, or n. And the second, proposed by Sommerfeld, described the 3D shape of those spheres. Is it a sphere, or a dumbbell, or a clover? This is the azimuthal quantum number, or L. The third, also from Sommerfeld, with input from Peter Debye, described how the subshell is oriented within an external magnetic field. The magnetic quantum number, or ML. 3 numbers. It's really clean and structured, and most importantly, you can visualize it. Lovely stuff. Except Pauli had the intuition that really there should be a 4th quantum number, what he initially termed the classically non-describable two-valuedness of the electron. Each electron could have one of 2 values, later termed spin up and spin down, and crucially no 2 electrons in an atom of any size could have the same 4 quantum numbers. That was the move. Now, this was clearly really original in that typically bizarre intuitive sense, but critically, it also made no sense whatsoever from the perspective of sensory perception. You can visualize fairly easily the first 3 quantum numbers. Hell, I've done it with my awful Adobe After Effects skills. You can even visualize other theories in physics. Einstein's curving of space-time, Newton's laws of motion. But with the 4th quantum number, you can't visualize it. It was soon dubbed spin by Uhlenbeck and Goldschmidt, something which Pauli was utterly offended by on the inside, despite it being a perfectly valid name. For electrons do not spin. If they did, their equator would be moving faster than the speed of light. And Einstein simply didn't build the universe that way. So spin was as close as we could sort of grasp what's going on. A form of angular momentum, but not literal. Anyway, here's the dagger which Pauli's reflection was holding in the mirror. Whilst in the wrong emotional state, drinking endless wine like a Norman baron and hanging out with sexy ladies of the night, he somehow spat out an utterly bizarre addition to quantum theory. He had no visual model or a classical precedent, and yet it was correct. This, of course, is the basis of the famous Pauli exclusion principle. He had just taken his permanent place in the history of physics at only 25 years old. Now, turn up the Pitbull songs for a moment, for the world was about to enter one of the most condensed, fruitful periods in the history of science. 1925. Well, Pauli produces the exclusion principle, but also 1925, Werner Heisenberg develops the linear algebra behind quantum mechanics. Cue undergraduate headaches for the next 100 years. Cheers, Heisenberg. 1926, Erwin Schrödinger proposes his wave mechanics. That's the famous Schrödinger equation. Cue 100 years of YouTube prophets staring into the second-order differentials like a crystal ball. 1927, Heisenberg, once again, proposes the uncertainty principle. Sorry, lads, the maths is the maths. We cannot ever know the position and momentum or energy and time of a particle simultaneously. Also, 1927, Niels Bohr, he goes full Niels Bohr, and introduces complementarity. Wave and particle are mutually exclusive. You can't have both at the same time, but you need both for a complete account of nature. Physics at this point is basically flirting with Taoism. This is something that would captivate Pauli for decades, and something which Jung would duel him over. Now, speaking of Jung, what was he doing, say, in 1927? Well, he just returned from Mount Elgon in Africa, experienced a very powerful Grail dream, and was now dedicating himself with extreme productivity to laying out an epistemology for investigating the psyche. We have covered a ton of this in the Jung project already. Link in the description to join us, particularly the papers Spirit and Life and Analytical Psychology and Weltanschauung. Absolutely S-tier work. Anyway, we'll get back to Jung in a moment. He's fine at Bollingen Tower for now, I'm sure. The physics world had exploded. Pauli remained an absolute unit, but crucially for our story, just as physics was melting into paradox, his personal life took a turn towards tragedy. In 1927, his mother committed suicide, and in 1929, he married a cabaret dancer. It didn't go very well. She left him a year later for, to Pauli's disgust, a chemist with lower prestige than him. His drinking increased. He kept going out to bars and clubs, getting into brawls, and literally being thrown out of windows. And he confessed at the time that life didn't feel under his control. A psychodynamic statement which Jung would later leap on. Life was simply something that happened to him. His colleagues noticed that the years after the exclusion principle weren't exactly triumphant. In fact, they were much closer to a descent. By 1931, they advised him to seek out professional help. And who did he consult? Yep, Carl Gustav Jung. Pauli booked a consultation at Jung's unnecessarily glorious mansion at ACAUSALITY in Zurich. He burst in, screaming, going on about all these weird dreams that he'd been having, often involving Johannes Kepler, the Renaissance-era scientist, and numbers 3 and 4. And Jung immediately sent him off, as you would expect of Jung, to work with one of his students, Erna Rosenbaum. He didn't want to contaminate Pauli's mind with his own interpretations of mythology and alchemy and science. Such a thing he saw in a moment of genuinely brilliant foresight would have ruined the chance to observe his psyche as a natural phenomena. Because he was a man who basically represented the materialist worldview, who was dreaming utterly mythically. Now, here's where it gets both interesting and entirely bonkers. So the move from 3 to 4 in Pauli's scientific work, right? Arriving off the back of a spontaneous intuition where he postulated a fourth quantum number was being represented still in his dreams. The same move. Why on earth would this be the case? Well, as per Jung's theory of dreams, when you sleep, you dream of your most active complex. It's very simple. So what was Pauli's most active complex? Well, clearly whatever was driving him towards his nightlife behavior with women and wine. And thus the parallel stands really quite stark. Pauli's intellectual work required the unconscious via intuition to bridge the gap between 3 and 4. And his psychic life was symbolically enacting the same movement. 3 to 4, outer physics and inner psyche, with the same structural transition. His inner world and outer work were not disconnected at all. In fact, his psyche, already in turmoil back in 1925, was responding to the physics he was working on in terms of what the late great Anthony Stevens called a sign stimulus. He needed to move from 3, masculine, rational and structured, to 4, wholeness, via the feminine element. And for a man, that feminine element is the anima, the principle that connects him to life, meaning and eros, and yes, the irrational. It just so happened, whether by sign-stimulus dynamics or something edging towards synchronicity, that both physics and Pauli, in 1925, required the introduction of the irrational. Yeah, really. Pauli and Jung didn't just sit there and go, oh, the numbers 3 and 4, archetypal symbolism, isn't it, mate? Wait, no. Pauli's anima issues mirrored the structural issues in quantum physics. He was hyper-rational, disconnected from the irrational. So too was physics. Niels Bohr himself openly said, yeah, mate, the universe is irrational. You're just going to have to deal with it. Man and his theories are not disconnected. Our theory of the world reflects the state and development of our psyche. This is true. If we are disconnected from the unconscious, from the domain of the irrational and the creative and, dare I say, the brilliant, then our theories will be too. You can't visualize the fourth quantum number, right? Quantum physics works via probability. It is irrational. And similarly, you can't visualize the unconscious. Psychic events also work via probability. They are irrational. Sorry, Newton. Sorry, Isaac. But Schrödinger and Pauli, Heisenberg and all the lads had just introduced the equivalent of Jung's non-ascertainable unconscious into physics. Now you can see why Jung wanted to leave Pauli alone for a bit. He saw this straight away. He smoked his pipe and he waited about a year until Pauli was back on his feet. Because if this was going to become something more than just therapy, it had to mature. And mature it did. Pauli didn't simply bugger off back into physics going, oh, I'm all better now. No, he was much more stable. His drinking reduced, mind calmer. He made his decisive move. He devoured Jung's works, embraced his long-standing interest in Kepler and the history of science, and began a research collaboration with Carl Jung. Over the next 25 years, the two men, two genuine polymaths, met in person and exchanged many, many letters. Slowly and carefully, they were building towards something much larger than either psychology or physics alone. A theory of everything. A theory which today remains incomplete. And I'd say, and I suspect that you'll agree, it would be rather good fun, nay, required of us, to excavate that shared theory to the very edge, to see what they really thought about psyche and matter and synchronicity, metaphysics, and the unus mundus, to lay it out properly with nothing left unsaid. Well, how great of you to suggest, mate. I'll order us both a pint. Are you ready? Of course we are. Let's go. All right. Imagine we're in Zurich, circa 1931. Jung with his pipe and Pauli with his glass of red wine. What are they discussing? Well, without a bloody doubt, and as they're both acutely aware of throughout their correspondence, they're in a team of one, talking about things which, if spoken too loudly, would get both of them politely exiled from European intellectual life. In the world of psychology, materialism still reigns, even though that might sound a little bit odd. So Freud, old now but still king, dominates the field. His second generation is rising. Some renegades, some loyalists, Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, his daughter, Wilhelm Reich. Public discourse is consolidating. Now, Jung, of course, is very famous, but firmly not someone your average intellectual takes seriously. Makes you feel slightly dirty already, doesn't it? In physics, however, well, things are really starting to wobble. Materialist to the bone ever since Newton rocked onto the scene. But around 1865-ish, something cracks. In the red corner, James Clerk Maxwell. Not a household name, unfortunately, but Einstein himself said that he was the greatest contributor to physics since Newton. Now, Maxwell does something really brilliant. Well, he did about 50,000 brilliant things, but here's the one which matters for Jung Pauli. He shows that matter is no longer primary. Instead, it's something that happens in a field. After Maxwell, proper Scottish lad that he was, the old little lumps of stuff pushed around by forces model is technically dead, even if people pretend otherwise for another 40 years. Now, here's something almost no one points out. Jung drew repeatedly on Maxwell. His concept of libido as psychic energy lives and breathes Scottish energic Lord energy. And the same with von Meyer, Joule, and Helmholtz. Jung's theory of libido was very, very heavily grounded in physics. The archetype, famously butchered today, was not a psychic content. It was an energetic psychic structure. Without Maxwell, there is no Jung at full strength. We're going to get there in droves as we press on. Now, circa 1900, Max Planck, proper bloke, works on black body radiation and comes to a very troubling conclusion that energy isn't a continuous field like you might imagine it, but rather something which comes in discrete packets, quanta, proportional to frequency. That's the famous E equals HF, by the way. If you've done GCSE physics, then you're already familiar with Planck. Now, the uncomfortable truth in all of this, despite being repressed by our intellectual sensibilities, was obvious and was obvious to everyone. Once energy is quantized, continuity is dead. And continuity is the last refuge of hardcore materialism. Einstein then comes along in 1905 with his theory of special relativity. We can sum this up quite aptly as bye-bye absolute simultaneity of space and time. Space and time are now relative to the observer. Caricature materialism is dead. But in what way is it dead? Well, even to this day, no one really knows, which is quite uncomfortable, but it's definitely deceased and buried somewhere under a Druid church in Glastonbury. Then, between 1925 and 1927, as we say, Pauli, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Bohr, they all write the epitaph. Yeah, mate, things are irredeemably bollocked now, aren't they? Quantum mechanics detonated the foundations of classical physics. Probability has entered the chat. Discontinuity has entered the chat. Observer dependence enters the chat. Materialism as a self-contained worldview is now running on fumes at best. But here's the thing with this. Physics wasn't alone in having this hissy fit, screaming like Ian Beale in EastEnders. Maths itself was also going through an absolute crisis. This is the part of the story I feel that isn't normally told. Back in 1854, one of history's S-tier mathematical geniuses, Bernard Riemann, basically stared into his pint glass and said, "Right, lads, you know this geometry stuff that we've all been studying since Euclid and the ancient Greeks? Yeah, well, it turns out that geometry isn't about space. Not really. It's about possible forms of space. Now, a ton of this was already latent in the work of Carl Friedrich Gauss in the early 1800s, a man who had both the greatest last name of all time, Gauss. Mate, Gaben turned you into a gun in Half-Life 1. Talk about canonized. And who was also one of the greatest mathematicians ever to walk the earth. But Riemann is the one who takes Gauss's insights to their natural conclusion. Geometry does not have to be Euclidean. Space does not come with a single necessary structure. Oh dear. Geometry is the study of manifolds with variable curvature. Or in translation, space is selectable, right? It's not a given thing. The structure of space is not logically fixed. Now, Einstein, by the way, bases the mathematics of relativity directly on Riemann. I feel that Riemann is criminally undercredited in the usual mysteries of the universe discourse. Now, enter Bertrand Russell, an extremely English gentleman, and his mate, Alfred North Whitehead. They look at this situation around the dawn of the 20th century and basically go, we're not having this. We're not having this at all. Riemann said that axioms are not self-evident truths. That must mean that maths is not self-evidently true. So what, it's based on pipe smoke, is it? Well, this is a humanitarian emergency. So they do what every normal man would do in such a situation. They write an absolutely megalithic monograph, Principia Mathematica, to prove that mathematics is entirely self-coherent, without appealing to anything outside the system to justify itself. Logic über alles. And they famously require several hundred pages just to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. I'm not joking. This is pure cathedral tier masculine intellectual behavior when allowed to inhabit its natural state. And then the same year that Jung and Pauli begin their collaboration in 1931, Kurt Gödel enters the chat and the universe quietly screams. Gödel proves something extremely, extremely painful. Any sufficiently powerful formal system cannot prove all true statements within itself, nor can it prove its own consistency. It must rely on assumptions that lie outside the system. So maths is indeed, it's missing something. Yes. Almost 100 years ago, logic itself destroyed the idea that logic is a self-grounding foundation. It rests on something else. What that something else is, nobody fully knows. So Roger Penrose today argues that Gödel's theorems imply consciousness itself must be non-computational, so rooted in quantum phenomena. So one of the greatest living mathematicians in Oxford right now has taken Gödel so seriously that he concludes not only is logic not fundamental, but consciousness can't be reduced to algorithmic computation. Now, whether you agree with Penrose or not is secondary, to be fair. The point is this. By 1931, physics had lost continuity. Space and time are relative. Probability governs the microphysical world. Geometry is selectable. I love to select some geometry. Logic can't ground itself. And Jung and Pauli are sitting in Zurich, fully aware of the magnitude of what has just happened. This is the intellectual landscape that both of these men were stepping into. So, psychology, outside of Jung, that is still hardcore Victorian materialist, a la Sigmund Freud. Even experimental psychology, a la Wilhelm Wundt, someone that Jung respected and referenced constantly, despite stark disagreements, was hardcore materialist. Everything in psychology outside of Jung's hand-built Bollingen Tower was just billiard ball cause and effect smacking around. Mostly, anyway. Oh, you're depressed? Yeah, that's the influence of your mother, right? Cause and effect. Now, that really was the model. Neurosis, hysteria, indeed everything which today would be in the DSM-V was considered a pathology. Simply an aberration within normal materialist axioms. Physics, by contrast, had only very recently accepted that hardcore materialism was dead and buried. It's gone, mate. But no one had the faintest clue what to do with that, except for Niels Bohr, who was simply and totally and absolutely fine with paradox. Based. Mathematics, always light years ahead of everybody else, had just committed violent seppuku and vowed to eternally tithe to something unknown outside of itself. Logic had limits, geometry wasn't fixed, continuity was gone, and the foundations of the whole world were wobbling. Thus, Jung and Pauli were indeed in a party of one. They could point to a few sympathetic figures, like Pascal Jordan, for example, already arguing that a phenomenological view of reality was the necessary conclusion of quantum theory. Now, Pauli constantly dragged Bohr into the conversation as a central pillar. And within analytical psychology, there were figures like C.A. Meyer and Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's inner circle who had already abandoned stock materialism years earlier. But beyond that, there was simply no one else around who had both the multidisciplinary range and the ontological sensitivity to consider a truly scientific unification of mind and matter without, this is really important, collapsing into either overt metaphysics or vague physics-toned vibey spirituality. You know the type. Both Jung and Pauli were acutely aware of this, absurdly aware. They saw the pitfalls and the reductionisms. They saw the temptations to drift either into dogmatic materialism or mystical inflation. I've seen the face of God. And because of that, what dominates their correspondence is less what you'd expect, geeking out over the archetypes. Oh my God, I love the shadow sky goblin priest. And instead, you see a ruthless, uncompromising focus on epistemology. How do we know what we know? Before theory, we must have method. Before any metaphysics, we must have criteria. Right, let's give Cornifer 50 Geo, the little rip-off beetle, and finally buy the Jung Pauli map of epistemology. Here are the criteria that they laid out before touching any theory whatsoever. 1. Metaphysics is banned. Hard no. The moment we stride into metaphysics, yeah, mate, the universe is divine, innit? Love me a cheeky bit of reified Plato on a Saturday night. We commit the exact same sin as materialism, premature reductionism. We install an axiom and pretend that it's self-grounding. The moment we go full metaphysics is the moment that we misuse Gödel. Oh, the universe isn't complete? Well, brilliant. Let's invent fantastical bollocks. No. Rule 1, no fantastical bollocks. 2, physics and psychology are equals. We do not prioritize one over the other. There must be a starting point that is immediately accessible to everyone, a ground from which we can introduce axioms into both psychology of the unconscious and physics. No hierarchy or domain supremacy or academic infighting. And 3, inductive discipline. If rules 1 and 2 are honored, then we must be holding a toolkit that allows genuine inductive reasoning to operate on what we know as a bloody fact and on what we are trying to model, even if that domain includes the unconscious or quantum weirdness. That's it. It's reasonable, eh? And this is the scaffolding for a genuinely scientific investigation into the psyche-matter problem. Jung and Pauli hammered them into the ground repeatedly across decades in droves. And we're going to follow their exact argument, lifted straight out of Atom and Archetype. First up, metaphysics. Why is this a problem? Why is it a problem? Well, it's been an unspoken problem ever since Sir Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam, rocked up circa 1600 and laid out his method for the instauration of the sciences. A man nodded to by some scientists today, Bacon is one of the least remembered canonical figures in intellectual history. Now, Jung cites him as a critical ancestor in the development of his theory of archetypes. Pauli circled his famous maxim, knowledge is power. But more importantly, the man was about 400 years ahead of the world with his radical re-evaluation of Aristotle into proper inductive reasoning. He didn't do the usual Renaissance-era routine of flirting with the ancients. He actively wrestled with them. Bacon is pure methodological dynamite. And I'll show you what I mean. So you've heard of Descartes, right? René Descartes, founder of modern philosophy, a mathematical genius, and the man who said, I think, therefore I am. And also the man who refused to get up before noon, very famously, because he was playing Hollow Knight until 4 a.m. Descartes is famous for deductive reasoning. His meditations on first philosophy, him locking himself in a dark room, doubting everything, has become one of the founding gestures of the modern world. Now, that spirit of doubting everything, it reminds me of something. Christopher Hitchens saying, there's no evidence for that, shut up. Richard Dawkins saying, well, whatever Dawkins has been saying since the 70s, to be fair. Daniel Dennett saying consciousness is an epiphenomenon. These are, I'm going to be mildly heretical here, all expressions of the spirit of Descartes, not science. That is the Bacon lineage. Science is controlled experiment plus inductive reasoning, grasping non-ascertainable patterns behind ascertainable facts. Science is the spiritual descendant of Lord Verulam, not Descartes. I'm currently awaiting the barrage of comments screaming at me for not accepting Hitchens' razor as a base piece of epistemology, because I don't. Now, let's cut to the meat. Descartes famously doubted, well, everything. Well, my senses could be fake. My dreams could be fake. How can mirrors be real if our eyes aren't real? What do I actually know is real? He concluded that only the experience of doubt was indubitable. He could doubt objects all day long, and he clearly did, and had a great time with it. But the process of doubting presupposes a subject. Hence, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, better rendered as I experience my own experience, therefore I am. And so far, this is really solid. But here's what's really rarely emphasized. About 5 lines later, he begins deducing the existence of God. And the argument runs like this. It's good fun. My experience is real, but the coherence of my experience across time must be sustained by something. Well, that something is God, that which is above me. Sorted, mate. And then he goes further. My sensory perceptions, my memory, even mathematics, they could be manipulated. So perhaps not only are they sustained by God, perhaps they are interfered with by another unseen force. Enter the evil demon, which is, let's not kid ourselves, basically Satan. Now, Descartes isn't stupid, despite him being slapped about endlessly by modern discourse. And to some extent, that is fair enough. But he's taking logic to its very, very edge. But the issue is stark once you see it, because his reasoning is deductive. It rests on logic. And Gödel later showed that logic itself cannot ground itself. Logic rests on something outside of its own formal system. So what happens in Descartes? He begins with rigorous doubt, and he ends with mythic categories. God and evil demon. And spoiler alert, these are archetypal structures. This is exactly the kind of language someone uses when their perceptions are biased by an archetype, meant in the strict Jungian sense of the term. Now, Descartes replaces what should really be non-ascertainable formal potential with metaphysical personifications. That's the move. And indeed, that's the sin. Not that he's wrong in spirit, but that where disciplined agnosticism would have sufficed, he lapses unconsciously onto an archetypal form of perception. That is, the thing which logic itself, as per Gödel, sits downstream of. Now, how is this different from Hitchens or Dennett, two of the four horsemen of new atheism, massively influential for my generation? Well, they also doubt everything, but they take it one step further. Where Descartes says the non-ascertainable is the domain of God and the evil demon, they say, well, the non-ascertainable doesn't exist, lad. It's just an illusion. Now, how is this not just repression? It's not methodological consistency, that's for sure. It's deductive reduction pushed to its limit, where anything not immediately present in consciousness or not blessed by a very specific statistical method is declared delusional. This is not Baconian induction. No, this is Cartesian doubt turned into ideological materialism, reductio ad absurdum of cartoon materialism. Jung and Pauli would have screamed at this. Einstein would have screamed. Schrödinger, Heisenberg, even Freud, even Darwin, even Maxwell, go on and on. They all would have screamed because the issue has nothing to do with atheism versus theism. The issue, at the end of the day, is epistemology. Do you smuggle metaphysics in through the back door, or do you do the literal opposite and repress everything which even smells of spiritual or non-ascertainable? Or do you discipline yourself to remain within what can be inductively modelled from experience? This is the line that Jung and Pauli stick to repeatedly. But here's the move of glory, mates. This is where Sir Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam, burns the barnyard to the ground with his flamethrower. His method of inductive reasoning avoids both the myth-smuggling trap and the tendency towards participation mystique with the selfish gene. And here's how you do inductive reasoning. It's really easy. Pick a phenomenon, heat, for example. Make a note of all instances where heat is present. And then you make a note of all instances where it's not present. Then look at what is irreducibly common across all the heat present cases, but absent in the non-heat cases. Well, boom. Now you have genuine data about what the underlying form of heat might be. That, simply put, that is induction. Now, this is really critical, really critical. The form of heat is non-ascertainable. You can't see it directly. You can't experience it in itself, but it is inferred from patterned regularities in experience. That move, that right there, is what Jung saw as early as 1919 as an ancestor to the concept of the archetype. Bacon was trying to solve the ancient dispute between Plato and Aristotle. Platonic form versus formal cause. The Baconian form, as the Victorian writer Robert Leslie Ellis later called it, is neither mystical essence nor crude material property. It's a formal potential inferred through disciplined induction. And let it be said plainly, that is exactly what Jung and Pauli were trying to uncover, the formal potentials behind both psyche and matter. Pauli even told Jung that his archetype theory had the potential to restore natural philosophy. Now, this is seismic. So Bacon and that true natural philosophy lineage is the methodological forefather of the Jung-Pauli project. He was trying to solve the same structural problem, and he explicitly tied that project to the Instauratio Magna, the great renewal of the sciences. This is civilizational architecture. So Jung and Pauli weren't alone. They were attempting to bridge the gap between spirit and matter, a project that animated Bacon, Kepler, Galileo, later Goethe, and Coleridge. The Romantic lineage understood that nature and psyche were not two alien substances, but Jung and Pauli stood on their own ground, let it be said. In their day, and in even more extreme form today, the problem was no longer, how are we going to unite spirit and matter? Such a question would have been laughed out of the toilet. The problem was, How do we repair the catastrophic split between them? A split catalyzed inadvertently by René Descartes, a split that mathematics had already exposed as unstable, a split that quantum physics was staring into, invoking multiple universes and other Marvel-tier constructs to avoid confronting head-on. The split between matter and spirit was stark to Jung and Pauli, and it's precisely because of that split that they warned against metaphysics. Metaphysics is simply a reflex, an overcorrection. It's the pendulum swing back towards pre-critical participation mystique, before subject-object distinction and the methodological discipline of science. Metaphysics is the reverse sin to materialism. It collapses the non-ascertainable, what we can't see, the unseen, into a concrete image. It replaces disciplined agnosticism with archetypal projection, and it mistakes psychic content for ontological structure. That is the danger. So, rule 1 of 3 in the Jung-Pauli conjecture: no fantastical bollocks. No metaphysics. We can have the so-called spiritual, but never at the cost of methodological rigor. Okay, what was rule 2 again? Yes, no prioritizing physics or psychology above the other. There has to be a starting point, immediately accessible to everybody, from which we can bring axioms into both psychology and physics. Now, this one is easy, right? Like properly easy. As we say, 1925 to 1927 was a seismic period for intellectual history. Pauli goes full Pauli. Heisenberg formulates uncertainty. Schrödinger develops wave mechanics. And Bohr, well, he just transcends into a paradoxical being. And almost silently, but just as importantly, Jung says something very quietly, very epically in a lecture in Germany. He says that he believes he has one single idea that could add something essential to our Weltanschauung, our way of seeing ourselves and the world. Well, what is this one idea, we may ask? Maybe the archetypes? Or the shadow? Perhaps the self? No, brace yourselves. Esse in anima. Not the anima. Esse in anima. Latin for being in the soul. Now, what the hell does this actually mean? Well, it means that our reality is always mediated through consciousness. Well, but of course, everybody says, how could it be otherwise? No. Slow down for a second. This is revolutionary stuff. Jung was restoring the philosophical spirit, literally spirit, from Anselm through Descartes. It's the recognition that something indeed exists outside formal systems, as Gödel forced logic to admit. It's Jung saying to GCSE physics students, yes, the equations are real, but your hatred of the equations are just as bloody real. To truly grasp this axiom, esse in anima, doesn't mean you have to become a Jungian and put up a picture of Marie-Louise von Franz on your wall. Not at all. It means that your disposition becomes one of the natural philosopher. You rejoin your forebearers at the ancestral pub. Because quite clearly, this view immediately and fundamentally alters your ontology. Most of us are conditioned to treat the material world as properly real. And the inner world, dreams, affects, intuitions, fantasies, as somehow second-rate or not real. Esse in anima removes that hierarchy. It grants equal ontological weight to both. For what is a mathematical equation? Well, first of all, it's real in and of itself, clearly. But it's also registered in consciousness, right? You're not inside the equation. It's literally an impression of experience, an experience through the strange, ineffable, and frankly bizarre phenomenon that we call consciousness. And the same goes for affect, an emotion, a spontaneous fantasy, or the collapse of the bloody wave function. All of it is given inevitably through experience. Esse in anima never once denies material reality. Material reality is great, mate. A McDonald's feast is absolute class. But why is it class? Because esse in anima relocates all experience to be within conscious experience. With that single principle, what we call spirituality, religion, the unconscious, everything of that kind suddenly gains permission to stand alongside atoms. There's no hierarchy here. Both are phenomena in consciousness. But it also gives you boundaries which feel actually really nice, to be honest. Neil deGrasse Tyson banging on about the stars is simply data esse in anima rather than the previous reality of esse in nihil. Adopting this view also gives us a very exciting bridge to solving the mind-body problem, one which usually isn't considered in consciousness studies today due to the lack of focus on a dynamic unconscious. Which makes sense, doesn't it? The unconscious is, well, it's unconscious, isn't it? And yet it's clearly the psychological matrix which shapes our consciousness. Okay, so consciousness is our reality filter. Through it, we perceive two worlds, the world of matter on the outside and the world of psyche, or really spirit, on the inside. It's great. But what the hell is consciousness? The darling question of all who dare to dream. Who am I? What is my essence? Bring the incense, Anno Domine. Now, we won't answer the question, what is consciousness today, unfortunately. That's partly to avoid a cage match between David Chalmers, Mark Solms, and Stuart Hameroff, but also because neither Jung nor Pauli really gave a single solitary bollock about what the essence of consciousness was. Now, this surprises a lot of people. You know, Freud didn't care either, by the way. The depth psychology tradition has always been concerned with the unconscious as a natural phenomenon, rather than arguing in your dressing gown with Michael Levin videos at 3 a.m. Something everyone agrees on, however, and this matters for the Jung Pauli conjecture, is that consciousness involves a perceiving subject realizing that an object in front of them is different from themselves. The famous subject-object distinction, right? So straight out the gate, we're going to flamethrower away absolutely everything which isn't immediately empirical to everybody on Earth. We shall not speak of a metaphysical consciousness blessing us with its graces, nor of panpsychism, where your true brothers are in the trees and the rocks. Now, either of those things could be true, and hey, if they turn out to be, that would be extremely entertaining. But now, consciousness for our purposes is simply the experience of being a subject. Your ego, you as a person. Now, we've known since 1885, and this upsets people, that consciousness isn't a single unitary thing. For example, Theodore Riemann proposed the existence of double personality. Eugene Azam put forward the idea of multiple personalities. But this idea reached its apex with our beloved Pierre Janet, Captain France. The myth that your mind is a single monolithic thing has been dead for around 140 years, mate. Now, Janet stated that outside of immediate conscious awareness sits a subconscious, a field of gradated energy where other perceiving subjects sit. Now, such a thing isn't normally considered in consciousness studies today, is it? Janet would have scowled. Now, Jung loved the idea of the subconscious, and he firmly stuck with it forever. He flirted with the concept of a wider consciousness repeatedly throughout his career. Pauli also loved it, but in his ever Pauli way took issue with the term subconscious. He proposed instead that we use the term degree of spiritualization or desubstantialization to describe the degrees of subconsciousness. C'est la vie. That is Pauli for you. Always allergic to anything which wasn't defined with absolute scalpel-like specificity. Even if there are other elements of consciousness in our mind, we don't know what it's like to be them, right? And thus we shouldn't imply that they're conscious. And honestly, I think it's sharp as hell. It kills the nonsense misinterpretation that people could come away with, right? That we have little goblins running around inside of our heads. But nonetheless, consciousness is not a single thing. Very, very weird. Our esse in anima, our being in the soul, is far more complicated than simply perception. Anyway, back to the good stuff. Esse in anima means that we perceive everything through consciousness. That also means, therefore, that the only thing immediately accessible, hic et nunc, another Latin phrase meaning here and now, is the psyche, the substance of what we call mind, and thus consciousness. For all you lads and lasses out there who've previously struggled with religion versus physics, this one is for you. Esse in anima means that there is no opposition between matter and psyche. None. Zero. To say so is a category error. We perceive matter through consciousness, and the inner world of the psyche through consciousness. Thus, the root of any empirical method isn't set up your experiments properly or control for your variables. Those are critical, obviously, but the ground state for empiricism is simply what is ascertainable hic et nunc, here and now. What presents in consciousness? It's the most ruthless criteria for inductive reasoning that I have ever seen. Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam himself, would have brought them both around, I'm sure. Now here's where the Jung Pauli conjecture really begins. The two of them divided the universe, the whole universe, by a very simple criteria. Two categories of stuff. Very, very simple. Some things are ascertainable. They present esse in anima, hic et nunc, here and now, in consciousness. For example, my face on your screen right now. Hello. Other things, however, are non-ascertainable. They do not present hic et nunc. This includes such things as complexes, instincts, and the archetypes. You can't see an archetype. It is non-ascertainable. But the same is also true in physics. You can't see the bloody Schrödinger equation in action directly, can you? I can draw it for you like this. Voila. It's lovely. It's gorgeous. Second-order differentials. But you cannot see its action in the world. It's a model which Erwin Schrödinger created to explain the dynamics of the non-ascertainable. I don't know about you, but this kind of epistemic hygiene genuinely makes me want to pour a pint and play Pitbull songs at full blast. It's refreshing as hell, isn't it? This division between the ascertainable and non-ascertainable solves two problems. It unifies both material and psychological phenomena under a single epistemic toolkit. Something that you psychologists out there will adore, I'm sure, as, it elevates a genuinely scientific psychology to the same epistemic rigor as physics. But also, it means that we have a framework for solving the mysteries of the psyche-matter problem without drifting into metaphysics. Hooray! The universe, from our perspective, ripe for empirical investigation, is always seen esse in anima hic et nunc, through the filter of consciousness, here and now. Psyche is that broad domain that we live inside, always. There's no way outside of it. And why would you want to be fair? Esse in anima holds the tension between the ascertainable and non-ascertainable. That's what all rigorous work in both depth psychology and natural science comes down to. Inductive reasoning on things which are ascertainable to determine that which is non-ascertainable. As per Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam, inductive reasoning taken to its extreme necessarily leads you as close as possible to the formal cause behind the phenomena that we see. That is our reality. Boom. And of course it is. Now, I'm going to divert into a historical turf war for a second, partly because it was an obsession with Pauli's, partly because it's rearing its head again today in droves, and partly because it's critical for our discussion today. And partly because, to be honest, I just find it highly entertaining. Now, swap ascertainable for being and non-ascertainable for non-being, and you've already got the language to tackle this without the need for a philosophy degree. Enter into the ring, Plato and Aristotle. Plato, the big lad of all Western philosophy, described the world as thus. Matter exists, but it sucks. It's imperfect. It's being, sure, but it's like the Windows 95 version of being. The forms, however, truth, goodness, and beauty, they're what really matters. The ground state essence of being. They are non-being, non-ascertainable. By their instantiation within matter, matter becomes more being, you know? I'm sure you get the general gist at the very least. The forms are ultimate reality, and matter sucks. Matter is a privation, a privatio of form. That's Plato. Now, Aristotle, the man later worshipped as the philosopher by our medieval ancestors, sought to save matter from being chucked into the metaphysical dustbin, as one does, of course. Thus, he introduced the notion of potential being, a middle state between being and non-being. Now, for Plato, matter was basically nothing. For Aristotle, matter was the potential to become something. This ancient argument is exactly the mistake that modern materialism is still making. Next time your Reddit tier atheist mate says, "Oh, we're all just matter," you can nudge them and say, "You know what that word means, right? It means potential. I'm sure you knew that." Watch him immediately descend into a katabasis synchronicity tornado as he realizes that his own internal experience has ontological validity without needing to tithe to nihilism. It's very entertaining. Anyway, the war between Plato and Aristotle, between privatio, privation, and potential, marks for Pauli the beginning of genuinely scientific thought, in embryo, obviously. Privatio is metaphysics. Potential is the start of science, a structure of cognition which liberates us from participation mystique with the glories of certain moral virtues as ontological reality. Love it. There's a reason that Aristotle was adored until the likes of Galileo and Bacon chucked him out. Pauli took this further. Aristotle, though brilliant, was ultimately overwhelmed by Plato and never fully developed his ideas into a dynamic principle. Science, however, has now reached the point where it can advance the Aristotelian path. In quantum theory, the dual nature of the electron, so wave and particle, expresses exactly the complementarity of potential being and actual non-being. It's fun, eh? Who'd have thought that Wolfgang Pauli would stare at his exclusion principle and immediately see the resolution of the Plato-Aristotle debate staring back at him? Don't worry if things are a little complicated at the moment, to be fair. We're going to recap everything as we go through. But suffice to say, Jung, probably sitting in Bollingen Tower at the time, smoking his pipe, rejected this being versus non-being stuff as sheer and utter fluff. He preferred the hardcore terms ascertainable and non-ascertainable. Pauli agreed. Thus, we're going to use them. Boom. That gives us two tools to work with immediately. Esse in anima hic et nunc, and inductive reasoning on the ascertainable to reach the non-ascertainable. Things get even cooler from here. Just as Aristotle viewed matter as potential being, Pauli saw the unconscious as the potential being of the psyche. Its unconsciousness is not a mere absence, a privatio, Plato's word, of consciousness, nor is it a metaphysical beyond in Platonic heaven, but a genuine mode of being in potential. Let that sink in. Yeah, how bloody cool is that? To regard the unconscious as simply, well, yeah, mate, it's the unconscious, innit, as people do today, or to call it a realm of mostly pathology, as Freud did, or to reify it into a metaphysical realm, as some woo-woo types do today, are the same error approached from different angles. Instead, Pauli advocated for a third road. understanding the unconscious as belonging to the same order as nature itself, a realm of potential forms that can manifest in consciousness as symbols, dreams, or even, we're going to get to this, physical correspondence. Yeah, I'm talking about everyone's favorite topic, synchronicity. This brings psyche and physics into parallel as complementary expressions of the same underlying process of becoming. Quantum probability in the unfolding of the psyche, what we can broadly call individuation, are based on the same underlying formal process, without resorting to metaphysics. Pauli and Jung simply took both physics and analytical psychology extremely bloody seriously. And the result was a watertight epistemology which paves the way for unifying matter and psyche. This means that the original raison d'etre of science itself is restored, with dreamy origins in medieval alchemy and rigorous instantiation in natural philosophy. Science in its modern form, however, is a very Victorian invention, a fracturing of the original spirit of investigating the wholeness of man and nature into separate disciplines, something which scientists and layfolk alike today are growing ever more suspicious of. Pauli, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, openly said that the purpose of science was to recognize that matter goes as deep as spirit, not that matter replaces spirit, and that every scientific statement is ultimately a statement about man, since we always see everything esse in anima, through the lens of consciousness. It's our archetypal forms of perception and apperception which determine, quite literally, what we see. Hence, the aim of both science and life must remain the wholeness of man, the unity of spirit and matter. Matter without spirit is simply dead. I mean, Plato intuited something real here, and dare I say, it's why scientists today are flocking to him in droves. They sense the death in matter, and they immediately leap to the psychological opposite. But on the flip side, prioritizing spirit over matter is, let's be honest, simply LARPing as a medieval priest. The unification between matter and spirit isn't in some magical, undiscovered scientific principle. It's self-evident. Matter is one essence and spirit is another. And when they are unified, we call that life. You, me, your dog, our mate Dave from down the local, a living being. A science which no longer splits man from nature, spirit from matter, or being from non-being, but treats their paradoxical unity as the foundation of knowledge itself. That's the original spirit of more than 2,000 years of our scientific project, the resolution of our world's founding argument between Plato and Aristotle. Sorry, Richard Dawkins, but Pauli has you, as the kids say these days, cooked. All right, all that talk of consciousness and the unseen is making me thirsty. The time has come to discuss everyone's favourite elephant in the quantum pub, the collapse of the wave function. Up to now, we've been happily waltzing through based epistemology like those small lads from The Wizard of Oz. We've followed the yellow brick road, and it's been class. But quantum mechanics has entered the chat, and it doesn't play ball with our sensibilities whatsoever. The wave function is not a physical wave, sloshing about the universe like a spectral manta ray, although it'd be cool if it was. It's a mathematical object that encodes what can happen, a structured field of potential outcomes. It describes probability distributions. Oh, is the electron over here? Oh, or is it over there? We'll never know for sure, but we can make a good guess. That's the wave function. Before measurement, the system exists in a state of superposition. Not like many things at once in a sci-fi sense, but many possible outcomes weighted by probability. And then something really odd happens, right? You measure it, you measure the system, and suddenly, instead of probabilities, you get an actual result. the wave function is said to collapse. Now, here's where many people, not you and I, mate, obviously, immediately lose the bloody plot. This collapse does not mean that the mind magically creates reality, or consciousness fires lasers at electrons, or your thoughts will bend spoons. Pending data on that one, to be fair. If you can do this, send me proof via email. Now, no, put the incense away. Anno Domine. Now, to explain what's actually going on with the collapse of the wave function, Niels Bohr, the transcendent being himself, has once again entered the chat. Bohr's position, the Copenhagen interpretation, as you may have heard it be phrased before, is really, really pragmatic. So for Bohr, the wave function is a tool for predicting what we can say about system state outcomes. Measurement is the moment where a quantum system is forced to interact with a classical measuring apparatus, something that produces a definite, communicable result. Collapse, then, is a transition from the language of probability to the language of facts. Lovely stuff, extremely based, masculine as hell. To skip to the good stuff, Bohr's key insight is this. You can't describe quantum phenomena without specifying the conditions of observation. The observer actually matters. Knowledge itself enters the equation. And this is where Pauli steps in with his glass of wine in hand, his eyebrow raised, because he fully accepts Bohr's physics and literally held Bohr up as an equal to Plato. Yes, he actually implied that. But he sees something much bigger lurking underneath. Since Newton, science had treated space and time as divine absolutes, objective stages where reality unfolds independently of you and me. So God was kicked out and space-time took his throne. But quantum theory smashes that idol to pieces because now we know that you can't detach the observer from what's observed. The act of observation can't be passive, right? It actually changes the outcome. It influences the outcome. There are theories to the contrary, I want to say, like Sir Roger Penrose rejects all of this as fluff, and quantum being an incomplete theory. For Penrose, the collapse of the wave function is likely an objective reduction due to a hitherto undiscovered quantum gravity component. Rather than hand-wave Penrose away, I don't either, by the way. I think Penrose is highly based. I'm going to address this later in the video. It's going to be good fun. But for Pauli, he asks the razor-sharp question. If the observer, so the human mind, is structurally involved in what appears in physics, then why do we pretend that the psyche is irrelevant? Esse in anima, after all. Why assume that only measuring instruments matter, but the structure of the observing subject doesn't? Now, Pauli is not saying that consciousness causes collapse. That's a modern YouTube disease. He's saying something way more precise, that quantum mechanics has already destroyed the fantasy of a completely detached objective observer. Once that wall falls, the rigid boundary between physics and psyche starts to look pretty sus, much like the old wall between chemistry and physics did before atomic theory unified them. In other words, quantum mechanics doesn't and can't prove that consciousness is fundamental. Again, that's a nonsense consequence of the decay of the cerebral cortex, but it proves that excluding the observer is no longer scientifically honest. And that is the crack in the wall through which Jung and Pauli burst through like the Kool-Aid man. Now, to walk everything back into Bollingen Tower, Jung looked at all of this and went, yes, highly based. Quantum mechanics is excellent, but that probabilistic aspect of reality that you keep banging on about was already stated, sorry to say, by countless ancient sages, especially in the East, since the dawn of bloody time. Now, Pauli walks in and says, well, Niels Bohr is the first man since Plato to be at home with paradox. Jung countered, in the world of science, yeah, sure, that's no small thing, but outside of Western materialism, this paradoxical acausal view of reality, the stuff you physicists are only just discovering, was already extremely well articulated. And Jung then finished, guess what? I've already been flirting with something that I'm probably going to call synchronicity. You'll love it, Pauli. Yeah, really. Synchronicity is central to Jung and Pauli's theory of the universe. But rather than simply name drop it and spread the incense around Anno Domini, I'm going to tease you and leave it until just a little bit later on in the video. And for good reason. For you can't meaningfully speak about synchronicity without knowing what an archetype is first. And it's a topic I'm very passionate about, not archetype in the integrate your inner shadow goblin priest Tumblr nonsense sense, the actual, real, obscenely easy to understand sense, the definition which deflates everyone obsessed with the anima as a guardian goddess and the shadow as inner Satan alike. The definition which would make Jordan Burnt Peterson scream into his copy of Crime and Punishment. The definition which apparently the only person on the internet who gets it right is Dr. Eric Goodwin, and everyone else disappears into the land of milk and fluff. Are you ready? An archetype is, drumroll please, an unconscious form of perception. That's it. That is literally it. That's all Jung said way back in 1919 when he first introduced the term. And yet we have had over 100 years of sheer and utter bollocks ever since. An archetype is a formal element in the unconscious, it's non-ascertainable, which recognizes certain scenarios in the outside world and it activates in response. It immediately releases drives, which we feel as affect, whether that's emotion, anxiety, whatever, doesn't matter. That's it. The archetype is a form of perception through which the unconscious perceives the world. So the mother, the father, a proper peer group, your lover, sickness, death, horrendous weather, hell, even food, if you are hungry enough. All of these things are seen by us as, things, right? But the unconscious sees them as critical, universally occurring, important phenomena. We see their representation and their elevation in myth, ritual, legend, and religion. And outside of this, we feel them, if the affect is strong enough, as genuinely mythic. That is the key with an archetype, by the way. The affect. If your perception of a situation is changed by a sudden massive burst of emotion, that's you encountering an archetype in the wild. Sorted. When we're small, our mother and father are essentially omniscient gods. They know everything, and their very word is ontology itself. When we're starving, food is as if divine. A tornado is as if wrath sent by a Homeric deity. Sickness is a pestilence with destiny and fate flirting at the corners. Death is a genuine crossing over, which provides somehow the last judgment on how you lived your life. Such perceptions are the perceptions of an archetype. They're irrational, an unconscious universal form of perception. We often see these forms enacted in the form of instincts. These are universally occurring patterns of behavior. And as I say, as representations in myth. But at the end of the day, that's all they are. Mystery solved. Christ, Jung would scream if he typed his own name into YouTube today. Well, actually, this is sort of all they are. Between 1919 and 1946, this is the definition that Jung ran with. The definition which the late, great Anthony Stevens brought into psychology as a genuinely based, biologically grounded phenomenon. A definition which lads in fields as far-ranging as cybernetics, linguistics, neuroscience, and psychiatry would all surely see as incredibly based, as brilliant. But Jung didn't leave it there. In 1946, he published his landmark paper On the Nature of the Psyche, the work of Jung's which Pauli references the most. He loved it, alongside psychological types. And in that paper, Jung lays out the move that makes Pauli sit bolt upright and go, Ah, you bastard. Jung realizes that the 1919 definition, right, that archetypes are unconscious forms of perception, is necessary and entirely self-sufficient for, working on yourself or with patients, but it's not sufficient as a ground state ontology. Why, James, you were being so biologically grounded. Why are you drifting into quantum mysticism? Richard Dawkins is screaming at you right now. All right, fair point. But also, no, not fair point, because perception alone, it doesn't explain the behavior of an archetype. It just doesn't, not when you get deep into the weeds. What Jung articulates in On the Nature of the Psyche is this. Archetypes are ideas in the Platonic sense, formal ordering principles, basically, and yet they are inseparably connected to physiological processes. They aren't floating abstractions, They're actually rooted in the body, in instinct, and in the structure of the organism itself. You know what? I'll make this immediately grounded. No deference to Jung nor Pauli. So, ever had an intense affective experience, one which feels utterly ontologically immovable when you're in it? Well, my father had one back in 2022. Our dog, Monty, passed away. Dad was a bloody wreck. Our little Fluff was here yesterday, and now he wasn't. Dad took it extremely badly. But as chance would have it, he emailed the breeder, 14 years on from picking up young Mont, to thank her for her role in his life. And guess what? She replied immediately saying, "Oh, by the way, I've just had another litter of Schnauzer puppies. Do you want one?" Now, to be clear, there aren't many standard Schnauzer breeders in the UK. You can count them on a single hand, if that. Anyone who's tried to buy a pedigree puppy knows all too well about the massively long waiting lists and the competition which comes when you finally end up meeting the breeder. But the moment that Mont died, my father, Mont's dad, so to speak, was suddenly offered, as if a bolt from the blue, the chance to do it all again. He rang me after this and I said to him, "Dad, it's as if Mont is saying to you, yes, I would do all of this again. You were a great owner. Adopt one of my cousins and do it again." Not to speak for him, but suffice to say, Dad was extremely moved by that idea, and he understood that such a thing was indeed somehow true. Even if not literal, there was a form of meaning there which constellated around the emotion, the affect. A synchronicity of sorts, more on that specific definition in a moment, which linked his own internal state with an external physical event, linked not by causality, but by meaning. It was circumstances like this, which he saw again and again and again, which made Jung feel like he had to expand the definition of archetype, not just as a form of perception, but something wherein the affective component, that means practically a huge surge of emotion, seems to correlate with unconnected external events. The key was not an abstract meaning of archetype. No, but a massive surge of affect. That was the key. Here's where we can have some serious fun with this. Esse in anima. Remember? Reality is always from the perspective of consciousness and the inner world, including affect. It's just as ontologically real as the external world. And the archetype, when strongly constellated, as evidenced by a huge surge of affect, seems sometimes to correlate with external events in an acausal manner. Yeah, Jung put forward in 1946 that the archetype had a psychoid aspect, an element which was beneath the worlds of matter and the psyche, the outer and inner domains, and somehow acted as an arranger of physical circumstances, not as efficient causation in the Aristotelian sense, but acausal ordering by what we can all feel as meaning. An archetype, if constellated strongly enough, could imbue events with meaningful order, which means they can be regarded simultaneously as a characteristic of psyche and of matter, the feature that allows matter to participate in meaning at all. This is the point at which Jung quietly steps outside of the tidy categories of psychology, and he says, we've been dealing with something structural to reality all along. Now, and this is absolutely crucial, archetypes are non-ascertainable. Remember that word from earlier? Rather fancy one, to be fair, simply meaning I can't bloody see it, but it's clearly there. I don't know its nature, to use a Kantian term, as such. You do not experience an archetype directly, esse in anima hic et nunc. You never encounter one directly, but you do encounter images, affects, instincts, and fantasies, and myths, and symbols, weird dream imagery involving your good self and your childhood dentist, who for some reason now has phenomenal thighs, behaviors and bodily reactions, both normal and psychosomatically weird. We see the effects of the archetype, but the archetype itself is never there, which means that we can't situate it in space or time. We can't point at it. We can't observe it. So what the hell is it, epistemically, at the deepest possible level? Well, Jung gives the answer, and it's so simple, to the point of being so very easy to misunderstand. An archetype is the probability of psychic events. Sit with that for a moment. An archetype is nothing but the probability of psychic events. It's the structural likelihood that certain experiences, perceptions, affects, and behaviors will occur under certain conditions, always in potentia, never directly given, yet they are reliably expressed. That's how you know it's there. Does this sound familiar? Well, here's where we come full circle. Niels Bohr, the transcendent being himself, would smile at this, I'm sure. This is exactly how physical law functions in quantum mechanics. A probabilistic law defines the space of possible outcomes and their relative weightings. Quantum sees probability in relationship to the observer, and analytical psychology, Jung stuff, also sees probability in relationship to the observer. The collapse of the wave function and the unconscious both operate the same bloody way. The archetype is a non-ascertainable structural element that interacts with being, that unified domain where matter and psyche meet to bring about teleological movement towards pattern and coherence and wholeness. Now, Pauli clocked this immediately because, of course, he did. For him, the archetype and the probabilistic physical law begin to look like two reflections of the same ground. One expressed inwardly as psychic structure, and the other outwardly as physical regularity. Not as metaphysics. Remember that. Rule 1, no metaphysics. It's a structural probability, an order emerging from potential. And suddenly the parallel, you can't ignore it. It's crazy. The wave function describes what can happen in matter, and the archetype describes what can happen in psyche. This is the same epistemology, just different domains of manifestation. And they're unified at what Jung called the psychoid level, beneath both. Hence, synchronicity is matter and psyche moving as one. Neither wave function nor archetype is observable. Both organize experience and both manifest through effects. Both belong to the same epistemic category. And once you see that, the old division between physics and psychology, well, it becomes unnecessary. All right, if you've survived this far into the video, first of all, kudos. You and I are clearly cut from the same cloth. The algorithm clickers have clearly buggered off probably about 4 hours ago, and thus you and I are left in peace to truly engage in Lord-tier discourse. Now that we've covered the groundwork, the essential groundwork, esse in anima, the ascertainable and non-ascertainable, the definition of archetype, both of them, and the probabilistic aspect in both physics, that's the wave function, and the psyche, that's the archetype, of which we can see their unification in acausal events like synchronicity, Well, it's time to cover Jung and Pauli's model of the universe. The entire universe. No hedging, my friend. What follows is exactly what they mapped reality to be. The reason that you clicked on this video. Are you ready? So I've synthesized all of Atom and Archetype, Pauli's writings, and Jung's collected works into a hierarchy, always prioritizing later writings, later works over earlier ones. So thus we're going to begin with level 1, consciousness and psyche. This is an easy one, to be fair. Consciousness is differentiated awareness. So that means that it can make distinctions between subject and object, and it can hold the tension between opposites. More on the opposites in a moment. And the substrate is psyche. So all consciousness is a psychic phenomenon. Now, using our principle of esse in anima hic et nunc, we can describe the irreducible nature of consciousness from a perceiving subject's perspective. This, as most in consciousness studies today agree with, and 1-0 to Jung, to be totally fair to him, is sensory perception. Sight, sound, touch, the so-called 5 senses, but also affects, hunger, thirst, tiredness, and the emotional affects of all kinds. These are all sensation. It's that simple. Now we can move to level 2. Level 2 comes from inductive reasoning on sensation, so on conscious experience. We know all sensation has a material component. That's just the thing called neurons, and also a psychological component. So you see what you bloody see, don't you? Consciousness, though, by its very nature, has the tendency to split both of these domains apart into irreconcilable opposites. One was Pauli's primary domain, matter, and the other was Jung's, something that he termed spirit. Now let's explore this. Matter is really obvious. As we say, we've all got a nervous system, a body. We're embodied. But to say that our sensory perceptions are the downstream result of the firing of the nervous system and just leave it there, well, it ignores the psychophysical substrate on which perceptions are built and processed. And this is the world which Jung termed spirit or Geist, and for good reason. It describes categories of the psychological unconscious. Spirit is not derivable or not easily derivable from the body or the external world. It's typically graphic, vivid processes that lead to abstract ideas. They usually come with a massive surge of affect, and they tend to form autonomous complexes. The biodiversity of the human psyche comes from spirit. Now, we've covered this a ton for hours and hours in the Jung project so far. It's one of the most crucial psychodynamics of them all. It's not matter and psyche which are opposites. We can't say that if psyche is our constant viewpoint. Instead, it's matter and spirit. Both matter and spirit are ultimately non-ascertainable in and of themselves. How weird is that? We can only describe their manifestation and their effects, always within consciousness. Somehow matter and spirit are unified within psyche. Hence they are level 2, the two primary opposites which psychological consciousness holds the tension between. Okay, now for level 3. The core opposites which mark psyche and physics. We'll begin with what are apparently irreconcilable within consciousness. This is good fun. Causality and acausality. Now, causality was the sole domain of physics, obviously, up until quantum mechanics smashed everything to pieces. The conscious mind's preferred way in our Western world to relate to space and time. Causality can be mechanistic, so, classical cause and effect, like billiard balls smacking into each other. Or, as per the guys who discovered the laws of the conservation of energy, it can be energic. Energy moves down a charge gradient from high to low, like electrons firing out of the negative terminus of a battery. Mechanistic causality is very much the domain of Democritus and his original atomic theory. Energic causality, though, is Aristotle's teleology, stripped of mysticism and firmly restored within physics. Freud's model of the unconscious was mechanistic. He did flirt with the energic view, sure, but it's ultimately an extremely logical cause and effect chain, influencing, something like the influence of your mother causing poor relating to women, as an example, right? Now, Jung's model of libido, though, was built on a synthesis between mechanistic and energic. There's absolutely billiard ball behavior going on in the psyche. If I suddenly scream in your ear, you jump and shriek like a yak as a direct result. But the psyche also operates along energic or telic lines. We're not born a tabula rasa, a blank slate. We all have unconscious psychic expectations and potentials, which under the right circumstances constellate strongly with energy and then discharge towards a set point. So causality in physics and analytical psychology is an extremely well-documented phenomenon. It's rock solid. But what about its opposite? Acausality. Well, acausality doesn't mean, hey, something happened out of the blue with no cause. Such a view would be sheer nonsense, as it destroys all relationships between all variables in all systems, forever and always. Instead, it simply describes discontinuities in the causality chain. So we see this in physics thanks to quantum theory, microphysical discontinuities, which we can only describe through reference to probability. It's been the nightmare of everyone except Niels Bohr, the transcendent being, apparently, since around 1925. Take radioactivity. We can only describe the decay rate of a radioactive nucleus through reference to a probability, its half-life. It's bounded by probability, but there are clear microphysical discontinuities which do not fit a causality model. If you scale this up, so you study 1,000 radioactive nuclei at the same time, then the effect strengthens. Energy and time, or really the space-time continuum, as per the uncertainty principle and complementarity principle, are thus complementary opposites. Consciousness can't ascertain both at the same time. Quantum disallows it. Now, this is also the case with the psyche. The psyche is subject to spontaneous acausal events, discontinuities between another complementary pair of opposites, conscious and unconscious. And this is where we can take our synchronicity talk and drop into absurd depths. So the famous monograph from Jung, right? Synchronicity and acausal connecting principle. Very famous book. Yeah, well, the word "an" in that title does a hell of a lot of work. Synchronicity was proposed as only one kind of acausality, a spontaneous acausality linked by meaning. The other type of acausality, as we've seen, is physical. So we can simply describe acausality exactly as we did causality, in terms of psyche and matter. Psychic acausal events are always spontaneous. Physical acausal events are always induced. Psychic acausal events reveal symbolic connection through equivalence, and physical acausal events reveal statistical patterns like the quantum laws. Psychic acausal events vanish when we try and scale them up and do statistics on them, as Jung famously found when he tried to do statistics on astrology. It didn't go very well, and he published anyway. Physical acausal events, on the flip side, though, they strengthen when you scale them up. So I'll just say it. The world has an incomplete theory of synchronicity based on one monograph from Jung. But not many people know that he worked on it for a further 5 years after publication alongside Wolfgang Pauli. Synchronicity is not the opposite to causality. This is so important. It's a type of acausality. And here's the lightning moment. Energy and the space-time continuum are opposites, right? Heisenberg and Bohr demand it thus. Now, this is also true in the psyche. We simply loop this pair of complementary opposites up to level 2 of our hierarchy. The energy of a psychic event and its relationship to the space-time continuum could only be known within consciousness. In the unconscious, we cannot know both at the same time. Ooh. Why, though? Because in the unconscious, distinctions like time and space blur. Just as in relativity, time and space are inseparable, and yet they blur. There's no distance in the unconscious. Time seems to be related to rather weirdly by the unconscious. Thus, modern physics and analytical psychology both reach the same threshold, an ultimate background where these opposites lose meaning. Yet on the empirical level, time and space remain incommensurable, just as causality and acausality do. Now, if this is confusing, I guarantee you're right at the threshold of it clicking. And here it is. Our level 1, consciousness, that splits energy and space-time, causality and acausality, matter and spirit, all the opposites we've mentioned so far, into complementary pairs of opposites. But in the quantum background and the collective unconscious alike, these are not opposites. They're simply, in a phrase that Jung used, so-ness. They're just so. The unconscious in itself is timeless potential. When consciousness differentiates and observes it, that potential unfolds into temporal experience, before, during, and after, right? Which is what we call time. Time necessarily unfolds within space, and thus sees the world in terms of causality. But underneath them both is a unified domain, the complementary opposites of energy and space-time continuum, and causality and acausality, with both being present within matter and psyche, tells you one thing immediately, via inductive reasoning. Quite simply, that there's a level 4. Okay, so level 4. We're now firmly in the domain of the non-ascertainable, the realm of the unseen, the level of reality where the opposites are unified. This Jung and Pauli termed being, and what Pauli on his own kept calling psychophysical, and what Jung kept calling psychoid. They are all equivalent terms. Again, unsurprisingly, this domain is split by conscious apperception into two domains, the unconscious at the level of the psyche, and the quantum background at the level of matter. Both are pre-formal fields of differentiation, not yet observed or reflected upon. They're characterized by distinctiveness itself, that is, the raw polarity or potential for the opposites. Space and time break down in both the unconscious and quantum worlds. Constellation of energy becomes a probabilistic event, and both, therefore, reflect a single unity, the point where matter and psyche stop being different things and they collapse into a singular domain, the psychophysical. It's this, obviously, which synchronicity and the opposites of energy and space-time continuum point to. Now, can we go further? Can we say anything about the psychophysical domain? Well, Jung and Pauli said, yeah, we can, and tons about it. But as we do so, we necessarily cannot use the language of either physics or psychology. We have to use, or at least move towards, what Pauli termed a neutral language. Makes sense, right? Okay, ready. Well, first up, they posited that there must be a non-concretized, non-literal substance which marks this domain, the so-ness of this domain, something for us to work with, right? And both of them settled on the term psychoid for this. And they also said, well, for any investigation into the psychoid, we have to come up with terms for different categories, right? So this is similar to any model of the psyche, by the way. You have to posit the existence of discrete categories based on our observations, esse in anima, hic et nunc, right? Like archetype. Both men settled on archetype for this. Not a psychological archetype like mother and father and anima and animus, etc., nor simply just slapping the word archetype onto quantum physics and calling it a lazy day, but simply that element within the psychoid which has its own typical form of perception and self-organizing behavior. In other words, you remember Pauli's dreams and the fourth quantum number intuition stuff? Well, something which was neither material nor psychological as such at the deepest level was nonetheless responsible for the perception of a psychophysical parallel, and for unknown reasons represented itself in the relationship between the numbers 3 and 4. And here's where we enter classic Jung Pauli territory, but done properly. These psychoid archetypes are the patterns of organization which underpin matter and psyche. They are as much inside as outside. They manifest both as psychic images and as physical realities. They are how we explain the existence of synchronicity. We infer they must be there through observing the probability of psychic events, ACAUSALITY, and the probability of physical events, also ACAUSALITY. Thus, they underpin psychic probability and probabilistic laws of nature. The psychoid archetype, whatever it really is, assimilates both domains, creating a joint field of tension. When we experience its strong connection acausally, then quite clearly causal and acausal processes are blurring in that domain. And Jung noticed that such a thing always feels numinous. Synchronicities always feel numinous. Now, as we say, we can't describe the psychoid realm in terms of the psychological archetypes. Such a thing would, one, be silly, but it would also be to prioritize the psyche over matter and accidentally create a Platonic worldview. Now, Pauli in particular hated that. However, we can ask ourselves what spontaneous self-organizing element exists both psychically and materially, but clearly rests on something outside of itself. Well, we've already covered this. This was the world of Kurt Gödel. Yes, mate, number. Jung and Pauli agreed that number is the most fruitful meeting point between psychology and physics for a neutral language, the simplest and most primordial psychoid archetypes, born from the unconscious as symbols of unity and order, but also the foundation of all physical measurement. They are both discovered and they are created, as inside as they are outside. This duality makes them the natural bridge between psyche and matter. Thus, when Pauli speaks of natural numbers and mathematical archetypes, Jung agrees that number is the key to the borderland between the two disciplines. Physics, he says, seeks to describe the world mathematically, while psychology reveals that number itself has psychic roots. The human mind, in grasping number, is grasping the same archetype that underlies physical order. Dare I say, the first archetype that humanity consciously discovered via its manifestations. But the ultimate psychophysical root is the form beneath the natural numbers and how they spontaneously self-organize. Now, number is closely related, it seems, to Jung's favorite obsession in his later years, the focus of his alchemical investigations, something he termed the conjunctio, and he proceeded to write whole books on. The conjunctio is the archetype of wholeness. All that means is, quite simply, the form underneath the reconciliation of complementary pairs of opposites. The same archetype of wholeness operates in both physics and in psychology, manifesting differently in each domain. Now, both fields are guided by the same archetypal principle here, conjunctio, physics seeking completeness through objectivity, and psychology seeking a home for spirit within matter, are two halves of one symbolic process. As we say, Jung famously saw it in alchemy, but Pauli took it further. He saw it mirrored in the physics of his day. I'll take the very famous Einstein-Bohr debate. Einstein said, God doesn't play dice with the universe, mate. The necessity for probability in quantum physics is clearly a sign that we're missing extra maths and not proof that we live in a paradoxical wonderland. Bohr, though, said, no, mate, no, paradox is fine, and also we've already proved that even if we did have more maths, the probability element would never go away. So for Pauli, both men represented one pole of a complementary pair of opposites. Einstein represented the ideal of completeness, so wanting physics to be total and deterministic, while Bohr represented objectivity, so accepting limitation and complementarity. Bohr's complementarity principle, where wave and particle are mutually exclusive yet necessary, is mirrored in the psyche. Consciousness and the unconscious, objectivity and subjectivity are complementary rather than contradictory. Pauli sides with Bohr, seeing Einstein's insistence on completeness as a regression, yes, towards the detached observer ideal. Yet he does concede that something in Einstein's longing for completeness is psychologically necessary. It corresponds to the archetype of wholeness, which can't be eliminated from our nature. So for Jung and Pauli, the psychophysical level of reality was marked by the archetype of number, which was in some way synonymous with the archetype of the conjunctio. Okay, so level 4 is looking pretty bloody exciting, isn't it? And yet Jung and Pauli went further. They often referred to this domain as the Mundus archetypus, quite literally a world of archetypes. You can think about this as the domain bounding the substance of psychoid, and out from which the archetype is observable through its action. It is thus not a Platonic worldview. It is constantly interacting with level 1, mate. Full circle. A Platonic world of forms is static. A mundus archetypus, though, is constantly manifest through transformative engagement with consciousness. And thus we reach level 5. Level 5 is what Jung and Pauli termed the unus mundus, or one world. This is not beneath level 4, but rather it encapsulates level 1 and 4 simultaneously. Consciousness and the mundus archetypus. So it's not a place, it's a process of becoming. That's the thing that people always miss when they speak on the unus mundus. By definition, the mundus archetypus requires consciousness as an observer to bring about a constant transformation of both from potentiality into actuality. Analytical psychology and quantum physics both move towards this unity. Importantly, this is where pure inductive reasoning necessarily reaches its limit, as Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam himself, hinted at but never wrote up a full treatment of. The unus mundus, as unfolding process of becoming, cannot be understood purely intellectually. It requires its reality to emerge experientially in the individuation process, when the opposites are reconciled within the individual psyche. You need both the masculine principle, logos, and the feminine principle, eros, or relatedness. You go to intellect or to eros, and you cannot hold the tension between the opposites. That includes, clearly, the matter-psyche split. This is the world which the unconscious sees and seeks to produce. What is, what was, and always will be, all at the same time. So it's not a cosmic unus mundus, but you becoming an unus mundus, alpha and omega, the beginning and the end, both timeless as the mundus archetypus and within linear time as you, as consciousness, the unification of both via what Pauli termed correspondentia. This was the absolute limit of where Pauli reached. He knew full well that the discovery of his exclusion principle and the development of his anima were intimately linked. For man to go further, he would need to individuate further, exactly as Pauli accidentally did. For the archetypal forms behind his perception to come into correspondentia with consciousness, and thus further depth and so-called truth could be perceived. Such a revelation, the unus mundus, is what all human intellectual life and personal development has sought to bring about ever since the very first caveman drew the very first symbol on a cave wall. That first symbol, the representation of Mundus archetypus potential interacting with consciousness, carried the seed of absolutely everything all humans have ever produced, scientifically, artistically, and creatively. Having mapped the hierarchy of the universe, where can we go from here? Well, I'm glad you asked, for this is where Pauli in particular really comes into a world of his own. He spoke of something that he called psychophysical parallelism. That's just psychoid, by the way, no difference. But more than this, he wrote an unpublished essay in 1948 in which he described something he termed background physics. Now, background physics was the symbolic key to unlocking the neutral language of the psychophysical, or the psychoid. Naturally, being Pauli, he based it on his own dreams. This was revealed to me in a dream. He'd constantly, and I mean constantly, dream of physics-based things which were very clearly symbolic stand-ins for his own internal dynamics. This clearly hinted that physics principles were recognized via archetypal forms of perception in the unconscious to be the same in kind as unfolding psychological processes. This is really weird. Something which you can hand wave away as coincidence if it happens once, but not if it's every bloody night for 20 years. So here's the deal with background physics. Every physical concept, like field or radioactivity, has a psychological correspondence, but not necessarily the same one. For example, fields and radioactive emissions involve invisible forces linking spatially separated phenomena. Psychologically, the equivalent is the unconscious conveying meaning between distant psychic events. Synchronicity as connection through equivalence. What's seen in the world mirrors what's realized in awareness. What's unseen corresponds to the unconscious factors that generate meaning. Now, Pauli wrote most extensively about radioactivity as a symbol of transformation. So the active nucleus, he says, is a perfect image of the self, the dynamic psychic center that radiates transformative energy. The process of radioactive decay in which an unstable element transmutes into a stable one through emission based on probability parallels the alchemical opus, strangely enough, psychic transformation through the emergence of unconscious contents into consciousness. The rays spreading outward are like the multiplicatio in alchemy, the outward expansion of an archetype into multiple manifestations. It's pretty simple, eh? It just requires a little bit of introverted intuition to see what Pauli means in your mind's eye. So when it comes to this neutral language, Pauli liked the word automorphism to describe it. Automorphism is basically when you pick up a Rubik's Cube and you twist it around and putting it back, where the stickers are in different places, but the cube itself hasn't changed its rules or shape. Every connection, rule, or a relation inside the system stays the same, regardless of whether we're speaking about physics or psychology. So here's some of his examples, and these are really good fun. So in physics, you have the atom consisting of nucleus and a shell, these electron shells. In individuation, you have the human personality consisting of nucleus, which is the self, and the ego around it, like its complexes around it. In physics, you have CPT symmetry. If you reverse charge conjugation, so you swap matter for antimatter, parity, so left-right inversion, and time, and the universe behaves the same way. But C and P on their own can have symmetry violated. So there's a left-handed preference baked into the universe. Known this since the 1960s. In individuation, the equivalent is that the unconscious, always represented in myth as the left hand, by the way, or the left side, takes ontological priority over consciousness. But overall, conscious and unconscious remain equal opposites. In physics, the smallest mass particle consists of corpuscle and wave, and in individuation, the archetype as structural element of the unconscious consists of static form on the one hand and dynamics on the other. Spectral lines are the equivalent of a unified psychic content or archetypal image, and splitting of the spectral lines, or like a doublet, corresponds to the division of a psychic unity into a true polarity, the prerequisite tension for the further development of the personality. E to the power of I times theta, as per Euler's formula, where it is equal to cosine theta plus I sine theta, represents the union of opposites, sine and cosine as opposites, via the imaginary I. I isn't real, and yet it is. It's irrational, exactly as the unconscious is. The periodicity of waves corresponds to, weirdly enough, one's attitude to death. Why? Because one oscillation signifies a single human life, but one which is to be interpreted only as part of a larger whole, which seems to be the way the unconscious views individual death, by the way. A chemical element is psychic content with identity, weight, and reactivity. Hydrogen being the most fundamental atom. When it splits, this corresponds to fundamental archetypal differentiation, rather than, say, the polarity defining a personal complex. In physics, the more mass that you have, the more costly the curvature in the wave function becomes. In the psyche, just as in physics, mass has a form of relativity. Its apparent weight depending on the psychic conditions of the subject. So the more charged with energy a psychic content is, the greater weighting it provides to the bending of the probability of psychic events. So of synchronicity occurring. We could go on and on and on with these examples. Pauli, with strong input from Jung, mapped tons of this stuff. But here's where things get spicy. So Pauli wrote that he looked to the future, and in particular to biochemistry, to provide another angle into the psychophysical parallelism problem. And I said that in my last Jung Pauli video, and about 4 million people all leapt into the comments with, "Pauli predicted Michael Levin. We love Michael Levin." Indeed, I love Michael Levin too. The man is doing proper Nobel Prize-worthy stuff. But rather than just grin in his general direction, let's actually lay this out properly. So Pauli predicted that the laws of biology wouldn't be reducible to the laws of physics, but rather there would be something else at work. When biochemical processes are induced, what we're really seeing isn't just a sequence of chemical reactions, right? But something like an archetypal pattern choosing among physical possibilities. This is what Pauli said. It's not chemistry, right, as biology was starting to realize, but an archetypal selection of suitable connections. Now, that's a huge statement. Pauli was implying that biological order cannot be fully explained purely by causal chemistry alone, that there's actually a formative principle, an organizing archetype that guides which reactions occur and in what direction. And in modern terms, you could say that he's pointing towards teleonomy and self-organization, the notion that living systems behave as though guided by internal constraints or informational patterns. Jung's archetypal selection prefigures ideas like morphogenetic fields, systems biology attractors, and downward causation in very, very complex systems. So order emerging not from random reactions, but from structured, meaningful constraints, a priori, right? And he connects this to his broader argument about absolute knowledge and reversed causality. Yes, Pauli went there. Meaning that what we experience as foresight or purposiveness may actually reflect a deeper psychophysical order where future states, so the telos or the archetypal pattern, influence present events. Now, such a thing only makes sense when we consider that space and time are relative to the collective unconscious, and indeed, they behave acausally in quantum mechanics. Now, Pauli, to be really clear, he didn't mean reversed causality in the mechanistic sense. Effect comes first, cause comes later. It's the psyche operating under different laws, where purpose, the teleology, and pattern are just as real as the efficient cause itself. Now, what has Michael Levin actually shown? Well, exactly what Pauli predicted. Biology cannot be explained purely through the language of chemical reactions. Development of the organism exists in a theoretical morphospace, and the organism seems to inhabit predefined cognitive style patterns without prior learning. Levin calls it the Platonic space, but not, I hope not, as a metaphysical wonderland. It's a statement that there's a cognitive field of sorts which evolution inhabits rather than generates as behavior ex nihilo. But to say it clearly, this is absolutely the domain of the archetype, and absolutely, definitely in the domain of Jung Pauli. Physics has quantum uncertainty, analytical psychology has the probability of psychic events as per the archetype, and developmental biology has a field of inbuilt potentials. These are the same formal pattern. Right, I'm going to take things further now, but with my own example, and this is for illustration only, for looking at the form underneath things. So in physics, spontaneous behavior is described by something called Gibbs free energy. G equals H minus Ts. That's Gibbs free energy equals enthalpy minus temperature times entropy. If the change in G is less than 0, you get a spontaneous reaction. A system changes state because a lower energy configuration is formally preferred. Fair enough. In cognitive neuroscience, spontaneous self-organization is described by the weirdly similar in form Friston free energy, where Friston free energy equals, to really simplify it, so if you're a neuroscientist, please forgive me, this is a deliberate simplification, expected energy minus entropy. If the change in Friston free energy is less than 0, then you get a spontaneous tightening of the model. The brain updates because a more coherent prediction model is formally preferred. The crucial point is not in the equations per se. They're not really important. It's the formal structure that systems shift when their internal free energy falls. A lower value is a more ordered, more coherent, more stable configuration. What Jung and Pauli discovered psychologically is structurally identical. Individuation can't be random. It's always a directional process. It's the psyche's telic movement towards the realization of its underlying form. I've codified this into a similar formula meant as metaphor only for illustration. P equals A minus ES. Psyche free energy equals archetypal drive minus ego field rigidity times entropy. If the change in psyche free energy is less than 0, then the unconscious reaches esse in anima hic et nunc. So it reaches consciousness directly. So the unconscious isn't raised into consciousness on its own, is it? That's the whole point of, say, analysis. So long as E and S are high, the ego has to consciously raise the unconscious to consciousness, putting in work and energy to do so. That requires reflexivity, ego strength, and a relatively calm mind without buzzing drives and anxious moral concerns bashing about. Here again, the system reorganizes whenever total psychic free energy drops. The psyche shifts because the archetype's telos pulls the system towards a more integrated state. When the archetypal drive exceeds resistance, consciousness expands spontaneously, exactly as in chemical reactions and predictive processing. Now, this formal identity across physics, cognition, and psyche, I feel, is really bloody stark. It's the signature of the psychoid, one structuring principle expressed differently according to which domain it's in. So I'm going to leave you with one final parallel. Now, Johannes Kepler spoke of the archetype of power. And what he meant by this was that the sun, the glorious thing, radiates a moving, intelligent force. The planets are drawn into orderly elliptical motion by that force. And the cosmos is thus a living mathematical organism, infused with divine ratio and motion. Kepler even described the solar force as a species of soul spread through the world, straight up anima mundi, or soul of the world, dressed in geometry. Now, Bacon wrote that the forces of matter behave as if innate instincts of the universe. Very similar territory. And Dante Alighieri, at the very, very end of the Divine Comedy, wrote that true human love was the same love which moves the sun and other stars. Human instinct, affect, and our lived inner world matches the forces of the cosmos itself. Or as the old Hermeticists used to say, as above, so below. And if that's true, if the structure of the cosmos and the structure of your own psyche are not alien to one another, but reflections across a deeper order, then Jung and Pauli were not indulging in metaphysical daydreaming. They were finishing something, or they were trying to. Something started by the natural philosophers of the Renaissance era. And what they built, more than anything, was unfinished architecture. An epistemology strong enough to hold physics and psyche in the same frame. And that architecture isn't out there per se. It lives in you, in the way that you perceive, in the way that you suffer, in the way that you reorganize yourself time and time and time again, in the way that meaning erupts into your life when you least expect it. That was their synthesis. Now, if you want to go deeper into that architecture, line by line, text by text, argument by argument, then the Jung Project is there. 43 full episodes already live, more every Friday. A proper community of people who would rather wrestle with archetypes and Gödel than scroll themselves into oblivion. So if this video felt like home to you, then you know where to find us. You'd be very welcome. And until next time, hold the tension between the opposites, my friend, and remember, as above, so below.